Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Islam in Life with me, Raza Ghazim. The West portrays itself as the champion of freedom and rights around the world. Ayatollah Khamenei, leader of Iran, has challenged that narrative in a letter sent last year, interestingly, to the youth of the West. Some questions do arise from these polarized views. Why does the West not recognize the death and destruction it has caused? And then, why does it want the afflicted countries to not talk about it and just simply move on?
The political elite in the West are breeding a mentality of violence in the world, according to Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. In an open letter to youths in the West, he said military invasions of the Islamic world by the West in recent years have given rise to countless victims, suffering humanitarian as well as severe economic losses. How can a country be turned into ruins, have its cities and towns covered in dust, and then be told that it should please not view itself as oppressed, he asked, urging youths in the West to stand up and challenge this culture of violence among its elite.
You know, there's massive evidence of the amount of violence that foreign policy is bringing to, for example, the Middle East. It's a prime example. How can there not be a backlash when you're looking at people in Syria, you're looking at people in Iraq, people in Yemen, suffering to the degree that they're suffering?
I mean, those who are religious scholars, they've been granted the spiritual side of knowledge. And through this knowledge, they understand that world history repeats itself. And we've seen the politics and those who lead nations before cause corruptions only so they can overtake those nations. And that's exactly what's happening.
I think the youth need to own Islam, but in the true spirit of Islam. They need to do that by, first of all, studying and understanding their religion and not knee-jerk reacting.
To address these and other issues, we have our esteemed guest, Professor Tariq Ramadan. Welcome to the program.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam. I want to start off by asking you to focus on one of the things that Ayatollah Khamenei has talked about, and also focus on the fact that this is an issue of how the West has actually been doing things and the prevalence of violence. It's been something that's been going on not just recently, but it has been going on for a few centuries now. Why is that mentality of violence there?
I think it's important to look at history, and it's also very important not to reduce our understanding to the West is doing this because it's the West. You know, violence and exploitation is as old as humanity. You find it in all our spiritual tradition, in all our religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is talking about how the dominant is imposing many types of violence. There is not only the armed violence and the army and the weapons. It's deeper than that. There is a psychological violence, there is a cultural violence, and imposing onto the dominated a frame that is not coming from within the tradition and the dominated culture or civilization and nations. What happened within our own civilization as Muslims is ups and downs, and we have exactly the same, forgetting that Islam came to serve humanity, and we were, in the name of our understanding of Islam, trying to be served by humanity and not to serve humanity with the West. And it started a long time ago. Coming and being the dominant civilization, it has to do with greediness, it has to do with geostrategic interest, it has to do mainly with economic interest. So when you are protecting your economic interest, violence is possible. You can find all the pretexts that you want, but at the end this happened in the 15th century, the 18th century, and even with the Ottoman Empire, the internal dynamics that scattered everything is coming from the British and the French and the Western dominant nations to try to take over. But this is not new, and what we are now witnessing are consequences of a very long historical process.
I think one of the things that is also happening within that context is that we sometimes view things without focusing on the issue around what the West in particular has done. And some of the decolonial kind of narratives that are now emerging is to not flatten the view of history, but actually to challenge it, that some of the things that have been done by the West is racialized it in a way, racialized things in a way that hadn't been done before. So, you know, that whole concept, that movement that started from the 15th century, and the demonization, the otherization that has been done there has been very different in some ways to some of the things that have preceded it. And it's been done on a global scale, where that globality, if there's such a word, did not exist before.
Yes, you're right. I'm not sure that it didn't happen because the people didn't want it to happen, or because they didn't have the means. And what you are saying is that the global dimension, what we are talking about today is globalization, but the globalization process started very early on. And what is adding to this is two things that are very important. The first is, you know, the process of secularization is differentiating between the authority of religion and rational authority. Put at the very place of the religious imposition or dogmatic imposition for what it was in the West, the economic forces that were driving politics. So the relationship between the global world and the very essence of this economic driving forces that we have from the beginning made it something completely new, which was not only a political colonization, it has an economic impact. And the one who was talking about this from within the Western tradition was even the Marxist tradition, saying, look, this is something which is driven by economic forces, and we use the political means to do this. This is one. And the second is what you said, which is important, is to portray yourself as the universal reference to the universal values, and everything else is the others. Even the construction of Europe is all based on who we are not in order to construct who we are. So it's a global process of defining us versus them. So it's based on this polarization, and this is what we have now. It's exactly this. And when the people, even in the West, are talking to Muslims or talking to black people or talking to Africans, say, oh, you have to integrate our universal values. So it's not only colonizing the other, it's colonizing the values, colonizing the normally shared universal values.
And in terms of recognizing that, since the dominant power, if you like, is the West, I want to focus on Western, and I'm using the Western governments very generally, is that have the Western governments, those that are culpable in this particular thing, done anything to try and recognize and introspect their own violent streak? And if they haven't, can they be made to introspect and recognize that violent streak so that they can actually start to deal with it?
I think that this is a good question, because when you look at what happened on the ground, the way this is perceived is telling you about the way the dominant civilization is looking at itself. And the only thing that you can see is it has been very selective. Some of these attitudes and behavior with the other have been acknowledged as being mistakes. For example, when it came to slavery and the way they were dealing with black people, they say, oh, this was wrong. Even though still within the Western societies, the structural racism is still there. Look at what is happening in the States today. But on the global scale, talking about what happened for example, in Africa, there is an acknowledgement that yes, this is something which was done. So with this racist approach towards the black people, there is something that you cannot deny that some countries acknowledge, and there is something which is the West Western psyche talking about this. The second thing, which is from within, what happened also with the Second World War, with extermination and genocides of not only one category of, the Jewish people, but the Gypsies and others. And this is something that was acknowledged. So you have a selective, but the selectiveness of the whole process is telling you something about why aren't you accepting or acknowledging of what you did in Asia, what you did in Africa, what you did in the Middle East? It's exactly the same process. In fact, dividing and ruling and taking from the people, but this is not acknowledged as much as it has been for other situations in history.
I want to take issue with one of the things that you said, that they've actually recognized that slavery is wrong. And for example, France made Haiti pay reparations in order that, how dare you say that you're going to reject slavery? And you have African nations still paying reparations, if you like, to France, so that they will not be enslaved. That's still slavery going on at an international scale.
Yes, you're right. And this is why I said some countries, and it dependent how they did this. So you cannot deny, for example, that in the history of the United States, the official history, there's an acknowledgement that something went wrong. And even in France, some of the sectors, so we have to be, when it comes to the African continent, which is not exactly the same with Haiti and others. So this is exactly the point. The point is selective. So when you acknowledge without having to pay too much a price about the whole process, you can do it. It's not going to have an impact. But my point is the fact that it is done that way, and the fact that we are not going as far as we should be in the West, means that there is something wrong in the whole way we look at our own history with the dominated civilizations and countries.
We like to keep the show as interactive as possible and really value your opinion. Here is what you sent us this week.
This week we asked, how can Western youths challenge this mentality of breeding violence? Sophie from UK said, I think both Muslim and non-Muslim youths in the West can play a critical role in influencing a more peaceful approach to foreign policy, since the youths today are a lot more liberal and integrated and do not believe in colonialism like their ancestors. Abdi from France said, I don't think youths can change anything. The Western political system is too closely knit to allow any change that would threaten the interest of the ruling elite. And Mohammed from UK said, the youths, if they want, can change this mentality. They can protest through the social media and rallies. And if enough youths do this, the governments will have no choice but to listen. That's all the comments we have for this week. If you'd like to have your comments featured on the show, be sure to follow us on Facebook or join us on Twitter.
One of the things, Tariq, that has actually come about is this idea that the working class is often, in this country, in the UK, has often been used by the Western political powers and the Western political elite. Now, this division of the masses of the UK, the working class of the UK, and the masses who are oppressed in other lands, has been a feature. Now, what is there any responsibility on the masses here to recognize that this division of is taking place? What is their role supposed to be?
Yes, and I think it was, once again, it's always the same process, is that you had some people acknowledging, and some even having as a project, what we need to do is to work with the working classes in the West and to create links and coalition with the people in, for example, in Africa or in Asia. This didn't work, except that what we had in the leftists and the left as an understanding of how do you resist the capitalist system. This is something which was there. The problem is that very often what was the driving force in the West is to protect the interest of the working classes here as understood, as opposed to the interest of the people on the ground in Africa or in Asia. So this responsibility is very important. Now, the political discourse in the West is not built on these alliances of forces. The one who had this, for example, and trying to talk to the West, for example, was Malcolm X in the States, saying, now we have to work with the African and we have to work with the Asian. And he understood when he started this that he was becoming more dangerous than when he was only talking as an American, a black American versus the white people.
And the example of Malcolm X is quite interesting in that respect, because when you start to build those alliances, in terms of creating problems, in terms of the narrative, I mean, what happened there? I mean, was he able to be successful in building those alliances, or was it just rhetoric?
No, this is exactly what he wanted. He went to Africa, he started to deal with and to have connection with Latin American forces, understanding that this is exactly the same logic behind, the rationale behind is, in fact, the symbolic violence and the physical violence that is coming from the dominant culture at different level, because it's not only military violence, is psychological, is cultural, is symbolic violence. What he wanted to do is to say, let us come to the roots of the problem and to try to work with African forces and even white people in the United States and the working classes coming together. And this is where, when he started becoming more universal and challenging the monopoly of the universal values by the dominant or monopolized by the dominant, he became dangerous. And he knew that this was going to be difficult. He was killed.
The letter from Ayatollah Khamenei to the youth of the West, he seems to have placed his hope that they might be able to do something. Are the youth of the West really capable? Are they able to challenge the Western elites, to challenge some of this streak of violence and culture of violence that actually exists?
You know, there are contradictory trends in the West. He's right on one thing. By talking to the youth and talking to the young generations, there is something which is happening in the West which is completely new. It's true in the States, it's true in European countries, it's true, for example, in Australia. Is that what you see, the young generations, they are much more pluralistic and they deal with other civilizations and culture. For example, millions of people coming from Africa, Muslims, are leaving. They are from the West now. So the fact that you have a dominant psychology, or a psychology that is not taking care of what is happening around the world, is no longer a reality. The West has changed. So we can be hopeful that with this new generation, something could happen. This is the positive side of the equation. The negative...
I was just going to ask you that, because one of the things is that that's a very nice picture to paint, but is that engagement there with the politics to actually be able to do something?
So the negative is, even with the people who came from Africa or came from Asia, they settled down, and in fact they are integrated. And you know, the problem is that we are asked to integrate within the West, and as if we have to lose our Islamic reference to become more westernized. The more dangerous thing is not that, is that you can sometimes keep some of, practicing superficially, but you don't understand the very deep challenge, which is, in fact, you integrate into a system that is still based on colonization, exploitation, geostrategic interest, and not caring about the people. And you know what is sad in the whole thing is that what we see with the young generation of new citizens, they are still within the same mindset. There is no political resistance, no political commitment, much less than in the 60s. The people in the 60s were more politicized and understanding the challenges that we have now. Now it's much more about interest, our personal interest, our families, our salaries, and not about caring about what is happening in the other side of the world or with the others, to the point that now, statistically, when our people are killed in the West, and it's the same for the young generation, this is much more worrying than when the people are killed over there. So when you start with this, the very old racism we were talking about is coming back. And it's coming back this time not only with white middle class, with everybody in the West.
So what you're talking about is actually in the way that the colonized subjects had internalized the colonized narrative. You're saying, in a sense, that the youth that are coming up have internalized the narrative of the Western elites, and then they are carrying on that same racism, in a sense, that you're talking about.
Yes, exactly.
Is there a remedy for this?
Yes, the remedy is first to talk about it and then to come back to our principles and say, is this right? Are you right in the way you are looking at this? So we need to have a better understanding of history and a better understanding of our principles. The problem is that, and not superficially, we need to come deeper in this. And this is why, in fact, we even need for Western young citizens something which is a liberation process, is to understand, liberate yourself from this narrative. When you see people who came, one generation ago or 25 years ago, and they settled in the States, and they are buying the American dream as this is the dream of their life, and it's working, you should be worried about this, because this is exactly this colonization of the recolonized mindset, and this mindset is there with people who came from the South, and they are thinking exactly as if they were with the dominant and carrying on the same dream of what is success in their life, which is not at all what should be the right path when it comes to our principles and when it comes to an ethical way of dealing with it.
I want to very briefly, because we're running out of time, one of the things I want you to actually mention briefly is that recently we had Robin Cook actually talking about ethical policies, in the last just over a decade ago and so on. Now, we had Iraq, Afghanistan. Some people find it insulting to use the word ethical and the Western powers in the same sentence. Do we really have any reason to hope that they're going to change anytime soon?
No, I don't think so. I think that ethical politics or ethical policies that we have is just a way of giving a nice way of dressing very dirty politics, which has had to do with economic interest and geostrategic interest. So it's not going to happen that way, but I would like us as citizens to be quite clear on, if they are not doing ethical politics, we have to be ethical in our citizenship. So this is why I call for an ethics of citizenship, which is able to do what we have done now, which is to be critical about this new colonization of our minds and hearts in a way which is completely in contradiction with ethical values.
The political establishment of the West is unlikely to stop its policy of dividing the oppressed masses of the West from the oppressed masses in different countries in the world upon whom war and chaos has been unleashed. In order to do that, the Western political establishment has demonized the other to its own oppressed masses so that they don't see the humanity of the other and collude with Western power. The question is whether this will be recognized. You decide, but from here, the future looks bleak. The time is up for today's topic. I would like to thank Professor Tariq Ramadan for his views on this topic, and of course all of you at home for watching. Goodbye until the next time and another edition of Islam in Life.